Welcome everybody. My name is Mindy Clues and here at Equinox IT I coordinate our learning services. Equinox IT injects fresh thinking to solve tough business problems. We deliver software development, consulting and training services in the Wellington and Auckland markets. Today I'm joined by Carl Weller. He's a senior consultant here at Equinox IT, and Carl will be presenting our webinar, The Edges of Scrum. Where does Scrum start and where does it end? If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter these in the right-hand side console. We may answer these as we go, or otherwise at the end in the question and answer section. We're recording this webinar today and we'll email you in the next week to show you where you can find the recording. We plan to finish today at 12:45. And I am going to hand over to Carl now. Carl, welcome.
Thanks, Mindy. We just seem to be having a little bit of technical fun with our presentation, but I'll keep talking while we're sorting that out. A little bit about me before we get started. Most of my background as a project manager has been in a traditional sense. I got my PMP, I got registered as a PRINCE2 practitioner. When I first became aware of Scrum, sort of 2006, 2007, I was initially a bit of a skeptic, as I think a lot of us were at the time. Sorry, just skipping through now. And the thing didn't go away. You know, you could have thought it was a bit of a fad, but actually Scrum stayed in there and got more and more popular. And we've got to the point now where actually it's pretty much recognised as being the dominant way to deliver Agile, to deliver IT projects. It's not the only way. There's certainly a lot of IT projects still using Waterfall, but there's a lot more now using Scrum or other Agile frameworks. So just looking at what we're going to talk about today, we will cover Scrum, just zip over it at a high level just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Then I'll look at Scrum compared to PRINCE2 and PMBOK. They are our two dominant predictive or planful methodologies, if you like. The reason I'm going to look at both of them is because they both have different strengths. PRINCE2 is very, very strong around project startup, overall governance and business justification and closeout. PMBOK is much stronger in the mechanics of being a project manager. So if we look at the touch points, the gaps, that will help us find what we're calling the edges of Scrum.
First off, we want to hear a little bit from you though. So we just put a poll up there on the screen. We want to hear from you about which of the following statements you've heard made about Agile teams. That Agile teams don't plan, that Agile teams don't control scope, that Agile teams don't do any reporting or manage risk, and that Agile teams don't need project managers. I'm going to put that poll up on the screen for you now, and you can select the one that most applies, or that you've heard most frequently. When most of you have responded, I'll close the poll and share those results with you. Carl, what I'm seeing is as more and more people respond, the percentage of people who've heard that Agile teams don't need project managers is a bit of a standout. Is that something that you've seen or heard more frequently?
Absolutely, and I think it's pretty easy because Scrum only has 3 roles and project manager's not one of them. So it's pretty standout. Equally, you could say, though, Scrum doesn't need architects or Scrum doesn't need analysts because everyone's called a developer as far as Scrum's concerned.
So I can see that that nearly 2/3 of you have voted now, and I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to share those results with you now. So Carl, that's how it ended up. 60% of people have said they'd heard that Agile teams don't need project managers.
Not surprised. I think though as we go through this presentation we'll bust that myth along with a few others. Well, I think we'll bust all of them actually. Let's go through them one by one though.
Okay, I'm just going to hide that poll and we'll return to Carl, your slides.
Okay, so as I said, we're just going to talk through Scrum a bit, what it is and what it's not. This is your typical Scrum cycle. You've got 3 roles. You've got a product owner, a Scrum Master, and a something called the development team, and everyone in that's called a developer. There's also 5 events: sprint planning, the sprint itself, daily scrum, a sprint review, and a sprint retrospective. And there are 2 artifacts, the product backlog and the sprint backlog. Now, the normal chain of events is that the backlog is either created or updated. You go into a planning session to decide what to deliver in your iteration and how to deliver it. You'll start executing the sprint. You'll have a daily scrum or stand-up every morning. And at the end of your sprint, you'll do a review or demo, and you'll have a retrospective. And basically what this whole thing creates is a bubble around the team during the sprint. Scope doesn't change or doesn't change much. Anything that would materially change the sprint goal is not allowed, but you can have clarification of requirements at a more minor level. You don't have a lot of discussion about whether something is a change or a defect. To that degree, minor clarifications within the sprint are actually quite welcome. The other thing to mention about Scrum, though, is as you can see, there are a few things missing. There doesn't seem to be a way that the project, if you're looking at it in that way, starts or ends. And that's because Scrum is actually a product development or delivery methodology. It's not actually a project management methodology, even though that's how it tends to be used. So now if we look at how Scrum works on a entirely different framework to your planful or predictive project. Planful or predictive projects set up a plan and then monitor variation against that plan, which is called defined process control. This is pretty much a manufacturing model. Scrum, on the other hand, uses something called empirical process control. And there's a bit of a story around this that is in quite a few of the Ken Schwaber books. Ken Schwaber was one of the 2 co-creators of Scrum. As the story goes, he went to DuPont to talk to some process control experts, and he took along a couple of typical IT project management methodologies, asked them what they thought about them. They had a look and asked them a few questions about IT projects. One of the standouts was, what's your typical success rate? He said, about 50%. The process control people were very surprised at this point, because what they were seeing was he was trying to apply a manufacturing type process control model to something that simply wasn't controllable in that way. Typically, manufacturing process control, the minimum success that they're happy with is 97%. Obviously, 97% success rate doesn't happen on IT projects. A good example as a comparison is if you look at what BMW did to set up the production line for the new 3 Series. They spent 500 million euros on setting up and defining the processes so that basically every car they built was a good one. Now, the way that empirical process control works is it's got 3 pillars: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Scrum achieves transparency by the close interaction of the product owner and a team. There's joint planning, everything's out in the open, so the progress of the sprint as it goes up on a great big chart on the wall. The retros and the reviews are chances for everyone on the team to talk about how things are going. Retros and reviews, along with the daily scrum, are also chances to inspect and to adapt. Now, if we go from there, and we just look at your typical PRINCE2 process, down the bottom we have directing a project. That's the direction layer of PRINCE2. In the middle we have the management layer, and you'll see there's a whole lot of documents there. You've got startup, initiating a project, managing a stage boundary, controlling the stage, closing a project. And then up above you've got the delivery layer, if you like, and that's represented by the team plans that are essentially an agreement between the project manager and the team leader or the team. It's these things here. Now, one way of looking at Scrum is that because it's a delivery framework, it effectively replaces the team plan construct, and your sprint plan effectively becomes your agreement between the project manager and the Scrum Master or team leader. And this is pretty much how PRINCE2 sees it in their PRINCE2 Agile extension. You can also add on, because you'll see there's nothing in the startup or initiation, there's a construct called Sprint 0, which is not technically Scrum, but it is used often in Agile projects. And that is, in a sense, a way of starting up the project. Now, if we delve into a little bit more detail, we look at the engine room here of PRINCE2, you've got the 3 layers and you've got a range of processes. Let's see how Scrum might map onto those. You've got one thing here, the authorized work packages and accept a work package construct, which is how the project manager hands over work to the team leader. Really, this is pretty much the same as the sprint commitment that the development team gives the product owner during sprint planning. Once you're in delivery, you've got the execute a work package and deliver a work package construct, which is really just sprint execution. Then you've got a handover where the completed work is handed back to the project manager and reviewed, and that's pretty much covered by the sprint review process in Scrum. I'd also argue, though, that there are some elements of Scrum that reach into the directing a project stage, because what you have with Scrum is a very direct interface between the product owner, who is the investor, and the delivery team. This is pretty much where things get crunchy, though, if you start thinking about using Scrum in an organization that may not be agile all the way through. And this I see is actually the area where either Scrum Masters or project managers have a really key role in terms of translation. So if you think about what typically happens on a Scrum project is, as you work through the iteration, it may become obvious that what you'd planned to do is not quite what you need to do, and you adapt as you go. Now, if you've set up a typical planful framework where you've got a business case that defines your benefits, maybe some major milestones, that's then elaborated into a PID or a project plan that's more detailed, has more detailed milestones. You have to be very, very careful not to create effectively a noose that strangles the agility of the delivery team. It is possible. I've talked to a colleague in Auckland who has seen a project run with a, if you like, a PRINCE2 wrapper around a sprint delivery framework. What you really have to do, though, is make sure that the level of abstraction in the PID and in the business case is right. You've got good tolerances so that your sprint team can actually deliver in a way that's agile and gets the results that you want and doesn't immediately hit the tolerances all the time. Now, if we just have a look at PMBOK, and I'm doing this because there are some quite specific things that are covered in PMBOK that aren't really covered in PRINCE2. This is PMBOK in all its glory. Don't try and read it. You'll just note there's a lot of boxes there. There's 47 processes in PMBOK. There's a couple for starting and closing a project, a grand total of 24 for planning a project, 8 for executing, and 11 for monitoring and control. So if we just look at some of these, there's actually quite a lot in common, a surprising amount in common. So the PMBOK construct, if you like, of handing over work, doing the work, making sure the work's done properly, is covered by these three boxes, which pretty much translate to the PRINCE2 view of the world of authorising a work package, executing a work package, reviewing work package status, which, as we've said, is pretty well covered by Scrum. I'd also argue, though, that Scrum covers risk management very well, and we have a slide later on about that. It covers quality management very, very well, and we can talk about that as well. And somewhat controversially, I know, I'm going to say that PRINCE2, PMBOK, and Scrum all provide ways to manage your typical constraints of time, cost, and scope, and provide a mechanism for change control. So just looking at that, planning, here's things I think that Scrum covers quite well. It covers how you're going to manage scope, schedule, cost, how you're going to manage quality, how you're going to manage risk. What Scrum doesn't really cover well, and this is where you start to see that perhaps a PM could be handy, or if not a PM, someone willing to do some of the typical jobs of a PM, it doesn't really cover human resource management very well. It provides some very, very good tools for coaching and mentoring teams, but it doesn't concern itself at all with how the team got there in the first place. It also doesn't really cover any other procurement activities that might be required. And communications management and stakeholder management, Scrum really sees that as the product owner's responsibility, and it's wrapped up pretty much in a single bullet point of it's the product owner's job to be the interface to all of the external stakeholders. So they're a little bit like a lens, if you like. They gather up all of those perhaps conflicting stakeholder rays, and they focus them in on the development team during the sprint. However, I think really for Scrum to be as effective as it could be, it wouldn't hurt to perhaps grab a few of the practices that your typical project manager would use for managing stakeholders. Now, if we look at planning, the graphic up here is a bit of a high-level representation of the levels of planning that your typical Scrum project will go through. There's a product roadmap, which the product owner creates, and that's aligned with their vision for the product, and that's translated into a product backlog. You do release planning then to think about, okay, what features might we want in, say, the first quarter of this year compared to the second or third quarter of this year, and just plan those out at a high level, literally at the gross feature level. Then when you start thinking about planning for a release that will have one or more sprints, and each of those sprints will actually be planned in detail during the sprint planning process, and it will create a sprint backlog. So if we just look at that, you'll see that at this point, what happens is pretty much what you would expect as a traditional planful project manager is you actually start talking about really concrete tasks, and you start talking about really concrete time frames. Really, what we're seeing here is that Scrum doesn't really deal with planning any differently to PRINCE2 or PMBOK at the abstract level. You've got concepts of detailed planning for the near time and more abstracted planning for further out, and this is something that both PRINCE2 and PMBOK support. So I'd actually argue that Agile teams do plan. They may not create 30-page plans that get signed off, but they plan in a great deal of detail, and typically that's 4 to 6 hours every 2 weeks. It's just that the level of ceremony is perhaps not what you'd expect. This is one that it's a bit of a head scratcher for me, to be honest, but I spent a bit of time researching this, and I'm going to say Agile teams do manage scope, just in the same way that traditional teams manage all 3 constraints. Agile teams manage all 3 constraints. And the slide that you're looking at the moment is from DSDM, or Dynamic Systems Development Method, and it's typically how you would portray the difference between traditional planned project and an agile project, traditionally scope starts off as fixed and it drives your time and cost estimates. One way of viewing an agile project is that effectively time and cost are fixed because you invest in X number of sprints, you've got a fixed resource pool and you can pretty easily work out what that costs. What you don't know is what scope you're going to get. You can of course also run a Scrum or Agile project using a fixed scope, but then your time and cost, just like on your traditional waterfall project, have to be variables. And I think this is something where it seems at the moment Agile projects are having a little bit more luck than your typical waterfall project. Quite often after you've published that 30-page plan, those two variable things become fixed and you end up with what's called an iron triangle. Agile, because of the way that it works in planning and the close interaction with the product owner, it actually allows you to avoid that iron triangle a little bit better. I think that'll be an area though that it will really depend on the organisation. I'd actually say though that if you think about how Scrum or other Agile frameworks manage scope, they do so by delivering the most important things first. What can happen on a waterfall project is you spend some period doing analysis, it's usually several months, you lock everything in and then you work through and you deliver that in quite a sequential way. But what it means is the client's actually waiting for everything right until the end, typically. You could deliver it in phases, but quite often that's not what happens. What that effectively means though is that when you get to the end, you may have delivered features that while the client wanted them at the start and they became part of the requirements, they might not want them at the end. They might have wanted them slightly differently, or they may not want them at all and would have preferred that you delivered some other features. And this is where Scrums actually does something very special. It allows you to swap out things that you now know are much more important to you than things that at the start might have been important to you but aren't now. So I'd argue actually that the way Scrum manages scope or the way Agile projects manage scope is a much better way of managing scope than you would on your traditional project. Just moving on to both risk and quality, what you'll see is your typical cost of change curve, but there's a slight difference. Just down the bottom, we're actually calling time the length of the feedback cycle. And if you think about some of the things that your typical waterfall or planful project will do, it's quite late in the piece. You know, you've gone through analysis, design, development, and you're into, in many cases, testing before you actually find some defects or get some customer feedback. In contrast, what will happen on an Agile project, and it does rely on a number of technical practices, which arguably could also be used on waterfall projects, is it brings that feedback cycle much, much closer to the delivery of the actual functionality. If you think about pair programming, if you've got two developers sitting there, one of them will get feedback from the other literally within seconds or minutes of writing some code. If you're using continuous integration, which is pretty much a requirement to do Agile delivery, what it means is every time someone commits some code, goes into the main branch, and if it breaks anything else in the code base, you'll know straight away. Again, with you, say you've got a sprint cycle of 2 to 3 weeks, which is typical in New Zealand, what happens then is you'll get immediate feedback from the customer after that 2 or 3 weeks. So you won't have gone through 3 months of analysis and 6 months of design and development before you get the customer feedback. You'll get it within 2 to 3 weeks. Just for this reason alone, I would say a combination of technical practices that manage some of your typical risks, such as integration risk or regression risk, and the short feedback loops with the customer, which actually treat the biggest risk of all on most projects, that is building the wrong thing, the way Agile projects work, they manage risk and they manage quality extremely well. So I'd say we can say that that myth is pretty safely busted as well. Now, on the subject of reporting progress, what we've got on the screen is a very, very simple task board. Can't really get much simpler than this. What you'll see though is the little squares in the bottom left-hand corner. That's the size of the task, if you like. In the bottom right-hand corner, we've got something indicating priority. We've got a little avatar in the top right-hand corner, which shows, I've called it task allocation, but really on Agile projects, it's the development team member grabbing a task. There's not a construct where the Scrum Master gives people work to do. The team take work as they can, and the intent there is to maximize flow through the team. You'll also see on one of the little graphics there's a looks like a stop sign but with a big white cross in it. That indicates that the task is blocked, so the person actually can't proceed on it because there's some issue. That's very, very visible on a board, and typically you might use, say, a red or a pink post-it note. That's pretty much to say, help, I need someone to sort this out for me, and it's a good cue for the project manager or Scrum Master to jump in and help sort things out. Down the bottom, you'll also see you can create some pretty basic progress metrics, and that's literally just by summing the points of the tasks in each column. Now, this isn't a report. It's not something that's created weekly or fortnightly or monthly and then sent to a select few people. This is up on the wall, and it's updated at a minimum every morning when you do a stand-up. Anyone in the team, not in the team, a key stakeholder, the product owner, can come down and see this anytime. So this is one of those things where we talk about high transparency. What it does is it allows people to see what's going on, and if they need to, adapt things just as they see them, rather than, say, waiting a month to have a steering committee report that something may or may not be going so well. Then typically what happens is you say, well, okay, you try and sort it out, come back in a month, report that you still haven't sorted it out, and all of a sudden you've got something that potentially has been going on for a couple of months before real action is taken, because the level of transparency is not that high. You can actually use one of these boards for a lot more, and this is pulling in some Kanban techniques into your typical task board. You can create, if you like, buffers or handover columns between different disciplines, where if work is a little bit lumpy, so you try and size things as well as you can, but obviously some things are bigger or smaller than you thought, it just smooths the flow a little bit. You'll see some green cards down there, and there's an arrow pointed to them saying technical debt story. If you want, you can create the equivalent of a feature card for technical debt work that needs to get done, and you can have that prioritized alongside normal work with your product owner in the sprint planning meeting. What that does is it's part of the Scrum quality management framework, if you like, between things like technical debt stories and a definition of done. You're actually making quality decisions on the project much more transparent than you would on a waterfall or predictive project. Typically what happens on a waterfall project is you lock in time, scope and cost, everyone starts analysing, you move into development, start getting squeezed for time, and the way that you can make that triangle fit is you can sacrifice quality a little bit, not at the level of, this is supposed to be a square shape, and yes, it is a square shape, but it might have some slightly off corners that no one really notices. This is something that I think is really great about Scrum, is if you're going to make those kinds of trade-offs, they're transparent. And one of the key tenets, if you like, of the definition of done is it must be agreed by everyone. So that's not just the project manager, that's the delivery team, the Scrum Master, and the product owner. Again, it's that high transparency approach. Typically, another thing that happens on projects is that non-functional requirements get forgotten for a while, and it's hard to sort of manage those in a transparent way. You can also have a non-functional requirement story, and you can move that through the board. And you can also make certain performance aspects just measures of your definition of done from that point forward. If you want, you can also create risk stories, so make risks management very transparent as well. This is a bit of an analog to how you might create a task in a Gantt chart for a risk action that might come out of a risk management plan. So as you can see, you can do an awful lot with the task board in terms of baking in quality management, managing some of your technical issues, managing risk. You can create much more fine-grained process metrics down the bottom. With the extra columns, it means you've got extra statuses, if you like. And then if you want to go the whole hog, you can create what's called a cumulative flow diagram, and it'll show you effectively how work tracks through the processes and will highlight things like bottlenecks. So again, I'd argue that there's plenty of tools and techniques there, and with the high transparency that Scrum and Agile provides, Agile projects definitely do report progress.
So we'd like to hear a little bit from you about what life's like in your work environment, and I'm going to start up another poll. So in your current work, how are project management concerns distributed? Sharing that poll with you now, and please select the one that is most like your current environment. Carl, I'm not seeing anyone say that they're fully distributed. No pure Agile or Scrum teams on the webinar today, but just under a third are saying that project managers still have full responsibility for distributing their work.
That's not surprising, and I think you see it, and I've seen it in projects that I've been on as well, particularly when you're trying to transition from your predictive waterfall model to a Scrum or Agile model. People feel comfortable with the roles and the patterns that they're used to. So quite often, if you're running stand-ups with a team that's just moving into a Scrum framework, they kind of look to the PM to tell them when they can talk. It generally feels like it's the team reporting to the project manager how they're going, where actually the purpose of the stand-up is for the people in the team to coordinate with each other. It's one of those inspect and adapt loops.
I'm going to close the poll now and share those results with you all. So you can see there, Carl, 70% of the people on the call would say that in their current work, the project management concerns are partially distributed.
That's actually what I'd expect, and really, I guess, if we jump back to the whole premise of this webinar, what it shows is that actually there is a need for project management in a Scrum or Agile framework, because there are some responsibilities that the delivery team are better at taking on, and some that the PMs are better at taking on.
I'm going to hide that poll now, and we'll return to Carl's slides.
Okay, so just looking at some of the things that I've noticed in the last few years running Agile projects, traditional projects, hybrid projects, the area that is still very difficult is what I'm calling the Agile gap, and that's that, if you like, translation zone between a pure Scrum framework, which, to be honest, I don't think exists at all in New Zealand, and an organisation that runs in your typical sort of manner. And as we've talked about, Scrum actually doesn't cover all of the stuff that needs to get done if you're working in one of those organisations where there's still an expectation that there's some sort of plan that gets signed off up front. You've got to justify the investment and continue to justify the investment over time. There's still an expectation for some form of reporting, and typically it's a little bit more than just a hand-drawn burn-down chart. There's also an expectation that financials will be managed, procurements will be managed, that the basics of HR management, so actually getting staff on board to be on the project, managing them a bit, and finding them a new home when the project finishes, they're still things that need to get done in most organisations. And we talked about there being quite a bit of communications and stakeholder management where a Scrum Master or a project manager actually could help out. And that really is, going to my last bullet point, that's the getting to the nub of the issue. There's a lot of work there to be done, and we can see that not all of it is covered in Scrum, but it still needs to be done. And the challenge really is for project managers or Scrum Masters to maybe learn a few different skills and pick up that work.
Thanks, Carl. We do have a specific training course, Agile Project Management, Adapting Practice to Context, that goes further into the role of project managers in Agile and Scrum projects, and this would be a good next step if you found this webinar valuable. We do have a few questions to answer before we close today, and I'll get to those shortly. Agile and Scrum training is available here at Equinox IT. The popular certified Scrum Master and Product Owner courses are scheduled regularly throughout the year. And if you are interested in how effective boards are for visualizing and managing work on projects, we do have a course, a Kanban course, that will teach you how to put boards into practice in your organization. You'll find those online by following that link. You might want to hear more from us and find out more about our next webinars. Subscribe to our blog. You'll find that link on our website, and we look forward to having you on our next webinar. Carl, I have a few questions. The first one I have is from Anna. She says that you mentioned the phrase definition of done. What does that mean?
So the definition of done is, and there are two aspects to it. One is, if you like, a product quality level aspect, and the other is a process quality level. But it's an agreement that the delivery team and the Scrum Master and the product owner all share that we won't consider work done until it looks like this. So your definition of done from a process perspective might be that the coding meets coding standards, it's been peer reviewed, all the unit tests pass. That's kind of from a process perspective. From a product perspective, you'll have acceptance criteria sitting under your usual user story, as are I want to, so that there'll be a range of acceptance criteria that determine whether or not that story is done.
Thanks, Carl. A question from Simon. How does the role of a program office change?
There's two ways to look at that. One would be kind of not at all. You know, if you're in one of those organizations where Scrum is still pretty much in the delivery space and you've got either a Scrum Master or a project manager, if you like, handling that translation from that world into the world of status reports, plans, etc., then probably from the program officer's perspective, they might be seeing something that, you know, is slightly less formal or slightly less detailed than they used to, but they're getting artifacts that they're pretty much used to. If you're able, though, to move to something where your organisation has become agile as well as just your delivery part of the organisation, then the role of the program office shifts a little bit. You start thinking about the program office actually working with all of the product owners in the organisation, and together they'll meet at some regular basis and actually decide what the delivery teams are going to work on for their next iterations. So you're moving into a portfolio space, but with turnaround times of 2 or 3 weeks.
Thanks, Carl. I've got a question from Angela. She's asking what tools are available for managing product backlogs.
There's quite a few tools out there that are very popular. The most popular would be Jira, and Jira has a pretty good licensing model where up to 10 users is very, very cheap. Also lets you run your risk and issue and defect management. Less formal tools, there's LeanKit, there's Trello. To be honest though, I'm actually a very big fan of your old-fashioned physical board. I just find it's easier to work with, it's easier to change your process around as you need to, and it leads to a better stand-up because it's just a lot more tactile.
Angela, when we share the content of this webinar, we'll include for you and others on the webinar some additional information that compares a couple of tools that we've worked with, or our consultants have worked with in this space. I have a question from Denver. Does Agile require more resources on testing because there should be more products to release, which means more regression tests should be required?
That's one approach, but it's one where if you're relying only on manual testing, you probably find after about sprint 4, your team grinds to a halt. One of the technical practices that's pretty much required on an Agile project is a high level of test automation. Because if you imagine it, say you've been through a few iterations and you've marked off 3 sprints worth of work is done, what you absolutely cannot have is in that 4th sprint for some of that work to be undone. There's no kind of stabilization or optimization or tidy up period at the end of an Agile project where you can fix stuff that you accidentally broke.
Got a couple more questions, and possibly more questions than we have time for today. One from Trish. What value do you see for project managers in helping their organisations adopt and get value from Agile practices?
I think the main thing is that there's now, after 15 or so years of adoption from that meeting in February 2001, there's a general consensus that Agile delivery is generally the better delivery methodology for getting higher quality, for getting value out quicker, and for delivering the right thing. Now, any organisation wants those things. So the value that a project manager, if you like, can add in helping your organisation is picking up that translation task and doing some of the things that Agile frameworks at the moment don't cover.
Question from James. It sounds like that you're saying there's still a place for PMBOK and PRINCE2 in organisations, even those that are using primarily Agile delivery methods. Is that the case?
Like most things in our business, it depends. If your organisation is happy that the only project reporting they're going to get is going to be a hand-drawn burn down on the wall, if they're happy that they can start up a project solely on what they're hearing from the product owner, if they're happy that they close down projects just when the project owner feels like they've done enough, if you're in that space, maybe not. But if you're in most of the organisations that we work in, absolutely.
Thanks, Carl. We do have a couple of outstanding questions from Graham and Angela, which we will respond to after the webinar and make that information and those questions available to you all. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded. If you believe others will get value from it, please share the link that we send out to you, which we'll be doing in the next week or so. When you sign out today, you will be asked to complete a brief evaluation, and that helps us get better at providing webinar content that you find valuable. Carl, thanks again for a wonderful value-packed webinar today. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.